Hello everyone, welcome to the Gardening Masterclass Growing Dendrobiums and Vandas in Singapore.
This webinar is organized as part of the Singapore Botanic Gardens Heritage Festival in conjunction with Community Garden Festival 2020. For more information, please visit our websites.
I'm Mark and I take care of the orchids and plants at the National Orchid Garden. I am also involved in the hybridizing of orchids to produce the beautiful hybrids that we name after VIPs and dignitaries here at the Singapore Botanic Gardens.
I'm Gillian and I'm in charge of the molecular biology and micropropagation labs at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. I study plant DNA in order to decipher species relationships and to determine the genetic health of plant populations.
In this webinar, we will share on how to select and care for your Dendrobium and Vandaceous orchids. You will hear about pots and potting media, sunlight, water and nutrition, pests and diseases, and vegetative propagation.
But first, some important information. Do take note that at the end of this webinar, we will be asking for your feedback. The first 200 respondents to complete the form will get to redeem an exclusive seed pack.
We also have 1,000 participants in this webinar now, but because of the large number, we may not be able to get all your questions. We ask that you keep your questions to today's topic about orchids so we can keep it fruitful. And do vote your favorite questions up. So Gillian, would you like to tell us more about orchids?
Yes, of course, Mark. There are approximately 25 to 30,000 species in the orchid family, making it one of the two largest families of flowering plants in the world. Some grow in tropical climates, while others grow in temperate or cold climates. Some grow on trees, while others grow on the ground, in soil, leaf litter, or on rocks. Those that grow on trees are called epiphytes, while those that grow in the ground, in soil, are called terrestrials.
Today, we will show you how to grow two different groups of epiphytic orchids, Dendrobiums and Vandaceous orchids. We have chosen these two groups of orchids because many of these species and hybrids in these groups grow well in our tropical weather. That being said, there are also species and hybrids in these groups which do not grow well in Singapore. Knowing the climatic requirements of any orchid that you would like to buy is important in ensuring that it will grow well in your home.
Good advice, Mark. It is also important to note that these orchids are epiphytes, meaning that they grow on trees in nature. So suitable options for potting media would have to reflect their natural preferences. Soil is therefore not a good option for growing Dendrobiums and Vandaceous orchids.
In terms of growth form, Dendrobiums conform to what we call sympodial growth, while Vandaceous orchids have monopodial growth forms. What I have here is a sympodial orchid, and this is where the active growing point of the orchid is, and each new growth will come out from this area, and each pseudostem will result in the same length, and this dendrobium will grow in a horizontal manner.
This vanda is an example of a monopodial orchid. Monopodials grow indefinitely from the top of the plant in a vertical direction. They can also produce side shoots along the length of the stem from growing points found at the base of every leaf.
Gillian, why is it important to differentiate between monopodial and sympodial orchids?
Well, Mark, sympodials and monopodials have different means of vegetative propagation, so knowing the difference would mean knowing the right propagation method.
So, Gillian, what advice would you give our viewers about how to select the right orchid for their home?
I would certainly start with selecting a plant that looks healthy, meaning it has a healthy green color and is not yellowing. I would avoid plants with black spots, although a handful of spots is acceptable. It's not always easy to find a perfect plant that's without a single blemish. I would buy one that's in flower so that its identity can be ascertained. I would also look for the presence of old flower stalks. Like in this plant over here, you can see one at the base of every leaf. And this indicates that the plant is a free-flowering hybrid or species. I would expect free-flowering Vandas to flower 2 to 3 times a year if growth conditions are optimal, and free-flowering Dendrobiums can flower up to 5 times a year in optimal conditions.
You should also consider how much sunlight your balcony or garden gets and select the plant that suits the light conditions of your home garden. You could also ask the nursery staff about the light requirements of the plant, or observe if the plant is kept under a shade cloth or exposed to full sunlight in the nursery. As a general rule of thumb, the larger the surface area of the leaf, the lower the light requirement is needed for the orchid. The larger surface area helps to capture more sunlight more effectively for the orchid. Leaves that are tougher in texture also tend to be more tolerant of sun exposure, but there are of course exceptions to the rule. We will elaborate on this when we cover the topic on sunlight.
We would recommend the following hybrids and species because they grow well in Singapore. The first would be Dendrobium inobi purple, Dendrobium ninja, Dendrobium hibiki, over here, Vanda lusnieri, Vanda suxamran sunlight, and the very fragrant Papilionanda mimipalma.
Gillian, many have asked me if they should avoid purchasing orchids with powdery substance on their leaves. What would you advise?
Those white patches are from fungicide applications that have dried on the leaves. They are harmless to the plant, but I would advise that you wash your hands after touching the plants.
Okay, now that we have selected our ideal orchid, what should we do once we bring them home?
That brings us to our next topic on selecting the right pot and potting media for our orchids.
Gillian, look at all these different media in front of us. Where should we start?
Epiphytes can be grown in clay and terracotta pots, as well as in plastic pots. Water evaporates more quickly through clay and terracotta than it does from plastic pots. So your choice of pots would have implications on your watering regime. Pots should always have drainage holes at the bottom.
We would advise that the cane dendrobiums and vandaceous orchids should be tall, should be potted in clay or terracotta pots to prevent as these pots are heavier and prevent the plants from tipping over like this. So this tall plant, is in a sturdy pot, so you prevent it from tipping over. Plastic pots that are lighter are suitable for smaller orchids such as miniature dendrobiums, although clay and terracotta pots are also suitable for these orchids.
And what do we fill these pots with, Mark?
The pots can be filled with potting media such as charcoal and bricks, like the ones that I have here. Charcoal on my left hand, bricks on the right hand. The potting media function mainly to hold the orchids in place and to allow water to drain freely. Charcoal also originates from wood, so it's a natural substitute for epiphytic orchids which are used to growing on branches on trees. They are inert, readily available in plant nurseries, and they don't break down so easily.
Brick chips can be used instead of charcoal, and the main difference is the weight. So if you have a heavy clay pot, You might not want to weigh it down further with bricks, so you would choose charcoal, which is light. If, however, you have a light plastic pot and a very tall plant, you would want to add weight to the bottom by putting brick chips. We don't recommend putting sphagnum moss in pots because it retains too much moisture, resulting in fungal and bacterial infections.
As a general rule of thumb, it is advisable to underpot your plants rather than to overpot them. What this means is to use a smaller pot as compared to a bigger pot when potting. For example, I have 2 pots here, and if you have an orchid, it's better to put the orchid in the smaller possible pot as compared to the bigger one. A pot that is too big may not be able to dry out in the middle and makes the plant susceptible to rot.
But you know what? These epiphytic orchids don't really need pots or potting media. You can mount epiphytes on tree trunks and branches, on fern bark and driftwood. You could also tie them directly to a fence, or you could tie a wire around the plant, like what we have over here, and hang it from a trellis or a rack. We'll show you how to pot and mount your orchids later on in this webinar when we cover the topic of propagation.
Once we've selected the right pot and potting media for the orchids, we have to consider their need for sunlight. There are many different types of orchids and that would be difficult to tell you exactly how much sunlight your orchids would require. Generally, Vandaceous orchids would require a higher light exposure as compared to Dendrobiums. We've mentioned earlier, as a rule of thumb, the larger the surface area of the leaves, the less sunlight the plant requires, and vice versa.
This Phalaenopsis has what we call strap leaves, while this Papilionanthe has what we call terete, or pencil-shaped leaves. The strap-leaf Phalaenopsis is able to capture more sunlight than the terete-leaved Papilionanthe, so the Phalaenopsis would require less sunlight than the Papilionanthe.
In addition, the tougher the leaf texture, the more tolerant it is of sunlight. These terete-leaved orchids have very tough leaves. Just by touching it, it's a lot firmer than the strap leaves that Gillian was talking about. There are, of course, exceptions to the rule, but this is a good place to start.
Once you have decided on a spot to place your orchid, you should continue to observe it regularly. If the leaves turn very dark green, the plant is not getting enough sunlight. Sunlight is important for flowering, so getting this right would help your plant to flower. If the leaves turn yellow or yellowish green, it means the plant is getting too much sunlight. Too much sun can lead to sunburn, and what you should do is move it to a shadier location and continue to monitor it. If the sun is sunburnt, it usually presents as a yellow patch progressing into black patches. And this indicates that a fungal infection has set in because the leaf is somewhat wounded from the sunburn. If you find that your orchids commonly develop fungal infections, you should check if sunburn might be the primary cause of these infections. No amount of fungicide will help if sunburn is the primary problem and it is not rectified.
As a gauge, low light levels refer to lux readings between 500 to 2005 lux, medium light levels between 2005 and 8000 lux, bright filtered light underneath a shade cloth from 8000 to 11,000 lux, and full sunlight from 11,000 lux upwards. A lux meter can be downloaded from the InPhone App Store, like the one I have on my phone, and most Dendrobiums and Vandaceous orchids minimally need medium light levels, and some species can even thrive in full sunlight.
Mark, what can I do if I want to grow a shade-loving orchid in a sunny spot or a sun-loving orchid in a shady balcony or garden?
Well, Gillian, if your problem is too much shade, I would recommend that you can use full spectrum LED lights or incandescent lights. I have brought some lights today to show our viewers. The light that I'm holding here is a full spectrum LED light, and this metallic colored light, that's an incandescent light. Full spectrum LED lights can be purchased from aquarium shops, and they are effective in growing orchids that require low light levels, such as soft cane dendrobiums, like the one over here. They do not, these lights do not emit much heat, and the only downside is the neon colors that they emit.
Incandescent plant lights can also be found at some major furniture stores that sell plants as indoor decorations. They are effective for orchids that have low to medium light requirements and are aesthetically pleasing. The only downside is the heat emitted when the lights are on.
If you would like to make a sunny location more conducive to shade-loving plants, you could use shade nettings. There are many different types that can be found in plant nurseries, and they come in iterations of 25%, 50%, and 75%. Over here, I have a shade netting of 50%, and if you notice, if I pull it taut, it still allows an even amount of light to come through. We would advise against the use of shade cloths like the one I'm holding, as they vary the amount of shade provided depending on how tight the shade cloth is being pulled. So if I pull the shade cloth tighter, it actually allows more light.
It is always easier to artificially reduce the light levels than to increase them through artificial lighting.
As we all know, the intensity of sunlight has an effect on the evaporation rates of water. This brings us to our next topic on watering your orchids. For larger areas, it is most efficient to water with a hose that has a nozzle attached at the end. Alternatively, gardening shops do sell portable misters like the one I have over here. Gillian?
In general, it is best to water your orchids, or any plant for that matter, when the sun is least intense. The best times would be morning and early evening. The reason for this is that water droplets on the leaves can act as magnifying glasses and concentrate the sun's rays into intense spots that result in burns on the leaves. And these burns can predispose your plants to fungal infections.
You should also avoid watering your plants after the sun sets, as that will mean your plants remain quite wet throughout the night. If this happens, you will be predisposing your plants to bacteria and fungal rot. It is best to let your plants dry out before watering, particularly for Vandaceous orchids. We would advise that to water your plants in a way that avoids an excessive amount of water pooling in the leaf shafts, as this will lead to rot. And this is where the leaf shafts are and potential problems where excessive water gets held.
Yes, indeed, Mark. Better dry than wet is a very good dictum for epiphytes. That's because epiphytes can tolerate drought a lot better than they can handle flooding. Mark, is there a way to determine how often we should water our orchids?
Well, Gillian, every home has its own microclimate, and that makes it difficult for us to give specific advice. Orchids growing in a low-rise home with higher humidity or in a shady balcony would require less frequent watering as compared to those growing in an apartment on a high floor or with a garden with very little shade. Seasonal differences in temperature and rainfall will also affect the frequency of watering. The key to growing your orchids well is to closely monitor their health and make your own assessment of the plants. Orchids provide us with growth indicators, for example, shriveling of leaves, indicate a need for more water and humidity. It is always a good idea to grow your orchids with other plants around like this, and having multiple plants together helps to increase the ambient humidity and thereby improving the microclimate in your home.
That's very insightful, Mark. I think we should tell our viewers about how to keep their orchids well fed.
Yes, let's do that. There are two main groups of fertilizers, organic and inorganic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers like sheep dung, which I'm holding, promote very strong root growth. However, they are very smelly, but what you can do is you can broadcast over your plants, or once you broadcast them, you can place them over, you can place a bit more soil media over your plants, and you can actually see results in root growth in a week. Inorganic fertilizers include gaviota foliar sprays, like the two green ones I have here, and slow-release granular fertilizers. There are two formulations of the gaviota foliar fertilizer. This is Gaviota 63 and this is Gaviota 67. They have different compositions of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Here at the National Orchid Garden, we fertilize our orchids weekly, alternating between Gaviota 63 and 67. These come in powder forms and they need to be mixed in with water. A conservative amount of fertilizer can be applied at a concentration of 1 gram per milliliter of water, and most orchids can tolerate up to 3 grams per milliliter of water. We will now show you a simple technique of applying slow-release fertilizers to your orchids that do not require much maintenance and work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a tea bag that you can easily get from the supermarket, and we are just going to add some slow-release fertilizer inside. So I would just put 2 to 3 tablespoons of fertilizer, and then I would just use a tape to tape it up, a bit of wire, as such, and then very simply tying it on top of your orchid like this. So what this does is when you water your orchids, or if they are exposed to rain, the fertilizers and the nutrients will naturally just get to the orchid.
Mark, if I feed my orchids well, will they flower all the time for me?
Once again, it is difficult to give specific advice, but even within a genus, different species and hybrids will have different growing needs. They will also have different frequencies for flowering and flower lifespan. Some orchids just won't flower more than once a year or once every few years. Some species need a distinct drop in temperature or change in day length to flower. Some examples are this Rhynchostylis species that I have behind me. This is Rhynchostylis celestis. Some require a period of drought to trigger flowering. Good nutrition would simply make the plant more robust. It is important to understand what environmental triggers are required for a particular type of orchid to flower.
Even with good nutrition, orchids can succumb to diseases. There are 3 categories: bacterial, fungal, and viral disease. Bacterial disease often presents as a soft, squishy, somewhat wet-looking spot on the stem, leaf, or flower. It's usually the result of excessive moisture from frequent rains or watering. It is important to cut off the diseased parts and reduce wetness. If rain is a problem, move your orchid to a sheltered area. You could reduce the frequency of watering if that is the primary cause of the rot.
Fungal infections can set in when a plant is wounded, either through sunburn or a cut site when you top cut your orchids. Fungal diseases can be detected through the presence of fungal fruiting bodies or through the presence of black patches or spots. Gillian, would you mind passing me the sunburn orchid?
Yes, absolutely, Mark. Here you go.
I'll need the other one as well. So this is where a rot this is a fungal infection that has set in opportunistically after sunburn. If your plant has a fungal infection, remove the affected part and reduce sun exposure or wetness, depending on what the precipitating factor is as such. Just put this aside. And there you go.
It is sometimes difficult to distinguish fungal disease from viral disease. Viral disease often presents as black spots or patches. Sometimes a pattern can be seen, like on this plant over here, where you can see some circular patterns. Many orchid plants have viruses and nothing can be done about them. There's no cure. Improved nutrition can help to negate the effects of the virus and help the plants to flower.
In general, improving culture conditions by providing the right amount of moisture, air circulation, sunlight, and nutrition will help to keep a plant in its optimal health. It is also important to practice good hygiene when propagating your orchids. Secateurs should be sanitized between plants to avoid transferring infections, and we will demonstrate this when we discuss the topic of vegetative propagation.
Some types of plants might fall prey to insects and other pests. Common pests of orchids include thrips, spider mites, beetles, snails, and slugs. Thrips usually damage only the flowers, and not much can be done about them as they don't remain on the plant for long. Systemic pesticides can help, but we wouldn't recommend them for gardens that have edible plants.
Spider mites tend to thrive when the environment is dry, so increasing the ambient humidity and ensuring good airflow is necessary to reduce occurrences of spider mite infestations. You can also use a weak solution of soap and water, and we will demonstrate how to prepare this solution shortly. Beetles and borers need to be picked off the plant, or you could dunk the whole plant in soap water. Borers usually occur in the shaft of dendrobiums over here. Sometimes you will see black dots, and that's where the borers and beetles have gone through the plant. Snails and slugs can be physically removed or combated with snail pellets, such as the ones we have here as an example.
Okay, Mark, shall we show our viewers how we prepare the soap solution?
Yes, Gillian, let's do it. So you will need a spray bottle, dishwashing liquid, and water. Next thing to do is mix approximately 1 to 2 teaspoons of dishwashing liquid with 500 ml of water. Oops, sorry.
Is that it? Okay, 500 mils over here.
Approximately 2 drops should be enough for this bottle. Next thing to do is to shake well before spraying.
Absolutely.
And
Never
spray.
forget to shake.
And spray on all parts of the plant, including the undersides of the leaves. So spray once or twice a week until the infestation is eliminated.
Bear in mind that these bugs might leave eggs, which you cannot see and which the soap water cannot kill. So do ensure that you keep up with your soap application until you have had about a month without any visible infestation.
Now that you're taking good care of your orchid needs and they are producing a whole lot of new growth, you might want to consider repotting or propagating your plants. Knowing if your plant is sympodial or monopodial will help you determine the correct method of propagation. Sympodial orchids form clumps, which should be divided, while monopodial orchids can be propagated by top cutting.
Okay, Mark, shall we demonstrate how to divide a dendrobium?
Sure.
The first step is to sanitize your secateurs. You can use a cigarette lighter and flame the blades of the secateurs. Make sure you set it aside to cool. Next, remove the potting media. And sometimes if it's a little difficult, you just have to try to ease it out of the pot. There we go. So remove the potting media, and you can cut off any dead roots that you see, or if the root ball is too dense, you can cut off some of the healthy roots as well.
It is a bit tricky when there are lots of roots.
Yes, exactly. So after this, what you want to do is to study the clump and see where is a good place to divide it. You should ensure that you have at least 3 pseudobulbs in each clump. Try to determine the active area of growth and guess which direction you think your plant will grow. This is only a guess, and the plant might instead choose to grow in a different direction. Take a new pot.
Probably use this one. Khew.
And place some netting. At the base.
So netting. Thank you, Gillian.
My pleasure. Fill the bottom with charcoal or bricks. And plant the orchid off-center, with the anticipated direction of growth going to the other side of the pot. What we are hoping will happen is that the orchid will grow this way, towards the other side, and fill out the pot nicely. You don't want to plant the clumps too close to one side, because the next pseudobulb that emerges might end up growing on the rim, and a whole half of your pot will remain empty.
Almost done.
Okay, beautifully potted. There we go.
There you go.
Another option is to not use a pot at all. You can mount your dendrobium on a slab of fern bark or driftwood. Mark and I very much prefer this method of growing our orchids, as it more closely resembles how orchids grow in the wild. Use a length of string or wire to secure the clump onto the fern bark.
Should add some sphagnum.
You might want to add a little sphagnum moss, as it helps to retain some moisture. The need for sphagnum moss would depend largely on the type of dendrobium that you are mounting. The soft cane dendrobiums, such as this Dendrobium dearei, tend to require more moisture during the establishment phase than other dendrobiums.
Okay.
And here we go, a nicely mounted dendrobium.
Just adding on, it's good to keep the wire tight so that when it rains, the orchid can stay nicely mounted on.
Excellent. If your dendrobium has keikis or side shoots, you want to ensure that the keiki has developed roots before you attempt transplanting it. You can jiggle it a little and see if it comes off readily. If it does, simply pot or mount it as we have demonstrated.
There you go.
There you go. If it doesn't come off easily, you will have to sacrifice the mother pseudobulb. Cut a part of the pseudobulb off with the keiki and pot or mount it.
There you go.
Fantastic. Now, moving on to propagating monopodial orchids.
Thanks, Gillian.
Pleasure. You want to ensure that you have a length of at least 30 centimeters and 3 healthy roots. Cut the stem at an angle and repot or mount the top cutting. It is important to note that Vandaceous orchids can grow to quite a height, so we tend to use a stake to support the cutting. You can use the potting media to support the stake, or you can use a stake resting against the pot to support another stake that Mark will now tie into a T shape.
Could you hold this for me?
Sure. Make sure it's quite secure.
Right. How does this feel?
Feels good. Well done. Okay, so next you want to tie the top cutting onto the stake. There is no need to bury the plant in the potting media. You could alternatively, if you're not using a pot, just tie the cutting to a tree or secure it to a fence.
Could you hold this for me? Sometimes we just tie two pieces together or to make sure that it's stable.
And if you need to, you can always wedge a brick chip into the base to keep your stake secure.
There you go.
And there we have our nicely potted top cutting.
Okay. So you could alternatively just tie the cutting to a tree or secure it to a fence. I wouldn't recommend tying it onto a fence that gets too much sunlight, as it will retain a lot of heat. And it shouldn't be tied together as a single plant without any companions around to help increase the humidity around it. Gillian, should we now take live questions from our viewers?
Yes, I've been looking forward to engaging with our viewers directly.
There are many questions coming in. Thanks everyone. In the interest of time, we will answer the questions with the most votes. All right. Okay, so the first question by Doris Lee. What is the best type of orchid to grow for beginners?
Mark, would you like to recommend some?
Well, actually, the orchids that Gillian has just mentioned earlier in today's masterclass, like these guys are very easy to grow. They do tolerate a wide range of conditions, so they don't need specific environments, and they can be grown in an apartment. They can also be grown in a house. And even without fertilizing, they will still flower for you, just maybe a bit less frequently.
Our next question is from Annie Lee. Thank you so much for your question. And the question is, my orchid hasn't flowered for 2 to 3 years. What should I do to make them flower again? Well, you know, Mark mentioned earlier that sometimes even if you feed your orchids well, you water your orchids well, and you give them the correct amount of sunlight, sometimes they just have their own frequency of flowering. They might not flower more than once a year or more than once every few years. You also need to understand the environmental triggers because, as Mark mentioned, some require a drop in temperature, some require a change in the day length. So it would be difficult to tell you how to make your orchid flower, except to say that please ensure that you feed your orchid well, you water it correctly, you let your Vandaceous orchids dry out between watering, and you give your orchid the correct amount of sunlight, because if the leaves are dark green and they're not getting enough sunlight, then that might be the problem. You might want to increase the amount of sunlight that you give your plant.
Okay, so we have another question by Michael Tong. The available space that I grow plants outside the flat unit is shaded with no direct sunlight. Is it suitable to grow orchids? And if so, what types? Well, if your place is outside your flat and it's shaded, probably Dendrobiums will be a bit better than Vandas. They don't require so much light. Off the top, we have some Dendrobiums up here. This kind will grow no problem, just that the flowering may be a bit more infrequent. The leaves, as Gillian mentioned, they will turn darker, but that's not a cause for concern.
Gordon Lim has submitted a question. It says, asks if Gaviota fertilizer needs to be diluted at 1 gram per mil of water. Is this correct? Sounds very concentrated for a weekly spray. Actually, Mark, I'm thinking the amount might be 1 gram per liter of water.
Yes. That is correct, Gillian.
That is
Thanks
correct.
for clarifying it.
Pleasure. So yes, please do it at 1 gram per liter and up to 3 grams per liter. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Okay, we have a question by Sally Seng. What causes bud blast in flowers, in orchids? Well, bud blast occurs for a few reasons. Sometimes if the plants are stressed, if they get shifted around, that causes them to blast. They turn yellow, they blast. Sometimes it could be insects. No, sorry, not insects. Sometimes the bud blast will occur because of changes in environmental conditions. When it gets too hot or it gets too cold, the buds will blast.
Our next question is from Kwek Ai Ming. Thank you for your question. If you are using fertilizer to encourage, it is how to water different species or pots of orchid, and at what time of the day, and what is the frequency. So basically, as we mentioned, the best times of the day would be to water when the sun is least intense, so morning or early evening. Make sure you don't water your plants at night because then they remain wet for the rest of the day. You want to make sure that the frequency is such that your orchids are allowed to dry out between watering. So, you know, most of the time on a hot day, I would probably water my orchid in the morning and evening. But if it's raining the whole day, then obviously there's no need to water your orchid then. So you will have to monitor your orchids and make your own decision. The microclimate of your home would make a difference as well, because if your home or garden is highly humid, then your water will evaporate less quickly, and therefore it will require less frequent watering.
Okay, we have another question by Vanessa Goh. And why does my orchid stem turn slightly yellow with spots? Sometimes the yellow spots come about from when the growing media is a bit too wet. That's when the yellow spots come around. And what we will recommend is to reduce the watering or move it to an area where it gets less water.
I was just looking for the right orchid to explain our next question. So our next question is from Jessie Ang. So the leaves have black spots. What does it mean? It could mean that you have perhaps watered your plant in the afternoon and the sun is very intense and your plant has gotten burnt. And sometimes there is too much sun exposure and your leaves get yellow. And then they develop black patches or black spots. And the reason is a fungal infection has set in. See, whenever a plant is wounded, so it could be through sunburn or through being cut for propagation, there's always a chance that bacteria or fungi can get in. So do make sure that your sun isn't getting too much, do make sure that your plant isn't getting too much sun so that it doesn't get sun damage and doesn't allow fungal infections to set in.
Okay, we have another question by Richard Cole. If we are using fertilizer to encourage flowering, can we also mix by alternating applications with fertilizers for growth? How often should we apply fertilizer? Well, I think there are two parts to this answer. Usually we fertilize, as a rule of thumb, use a weak fertilizer on a weekly basis. So what we do in the gardens and something that we encourage people to do is to, every week you can fertilize with Gaviota 63, and the next week you can use Gaviota 67. And actually, you can mix chemicals together, provided that they are not oil-based. And by mixing chemicals, it actually dilutes the chemicals further. So it can be done, but it's not so recommended. Having them kept separate is what we would advise.
Our next question is from Sweat Lei Liang. My Phalaenopsis has Perhaps we should move on to the next question. Jack Tan. Can the charcoal be reused? Mark, perhaps you would like to advise on this.
Okay, so can charcoal be reused? Generally, we don't advise because the charcoal may harbor pathogens, and even fungus. The fungal spores can be in the charcoal of the previous orchid. So generally, we don't advise. But if you want to reuse, you could usually give the original charcoal maybe a bit of fungicide just to be cautious about it.
I would like to get back to Sweat Lei Liang's question. Sorry about the interruption just now. The question is, my Phalaenopsis has a keiki. Should I separate the keiki from the parent plant or leave it alone? If it is best to separate the keiki, how do I do it without damaging the parent plant or the keiki? So we had a section just now where we showed you keikis on this particular dendrobium, like so. And you do have to make sure that there are roots forming first so that the plant can survive on its own without the mother plant. And you can either jiggle it or you can sacrifice the mother plant for the keiki. But because a Phalaenopsis is a monopodial orchid, you will be sacrificing the whole plant. So I would advise that for dendrobiums, yes, you can sacrifice the mother pseudobulb because there are just so many pseudobulbs. But for a Phalaenopsis, personally, I would actually leave the keiki alone because I don't think it's bad having side shoots, then you'll have a more bushy plant.
Yeah, and just adding on, when the whole plant flowers, you just get more flowers.
Bonus.
Okay, we got another question by Esther Chung. Can beginner orchids like Dendrobium and Phalaenopsis be grown indoors in my bedroom beside the window? Well, just now we mentioned earlier that you always need a microclimate to grow orchids. If you have a window that does not get too much light, maybe anywhere from 800 lux thereabouts, you should be okay, but you do need humidity for Phalaenopsis. Dendrobiums are a bit more hardy. Sometimes they could do on their own, but of course it's best to have a few orchids together. And generally, just got to consider when you water your plants, it doesn't get on the things along your bedside, and it's kept on an area on its own.
And the next question is from David Cheong. How do you know that the roots of the orchid are healthy? Well, basically, you want to look for white roots. The roots are covered by a layer of cells that we call the velamen, and this layer of cells helps the orchid to absorb and retain moisture in between waterings or in between rains. Healthy roots should be white, and they should usually also have a growing tip. Quite often, the growing tips for orchids are either this sort of maroonish color or a green color. On this particular orchid, they're mostly maroon. On other orchids, you'll see green tips. And these dendrobiums here, like these keikis, they also have pretty healthy roots. You can see that the roots are white. So white roots are good, black roots not good.
Okay, and the next question we have by Wendy Zhao. Can I use neem oil as a fungicide? Well, it would protect. Well, neem is generally a very light and very weak sort of chemical. It can be used to prevent fungus, but it is not the most effective. But if it's in an indoor environment, we would say, yeah, okay, go ahead.
The next question is from Pauline Lee. Can I use the driftwood to grow sympodial type of orchids? Do I simply use wire to tie the roots to the stems to the piece of wood? Yes, as we mentioned earlier, Mark and I really love using driftwood or fern bark. So you can use things like that. You can use this sort of board, and you can use fern bark. And the reason is they just allow water to flow through very well, and the orchid will retain only the amount of water that it wants to retain, that it needs to retain. And Mark demonstrated earlier on how you secure the dendrobium, the clump, onto the piece of driftwood, board or fern bark. You just need to use a piece of wire to secure it firmly. If it is a soft cane dendrobium, you would want to put a little bit of sphagnum moss to increase the moisture retention. So yes, do use driftwood. It's a very good idea.
Okay, let's take the next question by Jasmine Go. Can we use Dettol or sanitizer to sanitize the scissors before cutting the orchids? Gillian, would you like to take this?
Yeah, sure, Mark. I would say that flaming the secateurs would be the best way, because then you ensure that you get rid of bacteria and hopefully viruses as well, because Dettol will not clean out the viruses. So flame would be the best, and leave the secateurs aside to cool before you use them on your orchids.
Okay. All right, we have the next question by, sorry if I get the pronunciation wrong, Jia Noi. My orchid has been flowering non-stop for the last 1 year, but suddenly stopped flowering for the last 3 months, and the leaves keep falling off one by one. Okay, well, we don't know what orchid it is, but it looks like you were doing something, the plant was doing good. And the thing with flower production is that it takes a lot of energy. So when it's producing flowers, it's actually expending a lot of energy, and when the orchid has stopped flowering, it is probably trying to recoup the energy, take in more nitrogen, and get its strength back before it starts flowering again. As to why the leaves keep falling off one by one, well, it's hard to determine what kind of orchid it is, but it's probably just, well, when its leaves dropping, it probably means it's undergoing a bit of stress.
Or Mark, would you agree that it could perhaps be a deciduous orchid that needs to drop leaves before it can flower again?
Yeah, and that could be another reason as well.
Yeah, and not flowering for 3 months is actually okay.
Yeah, it's pretty all right.
Yeah, it's not too long, 3 months. Okay, so let's take the next question from Lee Zhou. What kind of orchid needs to grow in a pot versus hanging? So today we have demonstrated on Vandaceous orchids as well as Dendrobiums, and these orchids are epiphytes. So as we have mentioned, they can grow in clay terracotta pots, in plastic pots as well. And you don't even need pots. You can use fern bark, driftwood, or tie them to a tree or tree branch. You can tie them to a fence. There are just so many options for epiphytes, because when they grow in nature, they just hang off the side of a tree. So they don't really need a pot. However, if you're growing terrestrial orchids, which are orchids that are used to growing in soil, then you should grow them in a pot or directly in your garden if you have a garden. And use a pot, put soil in there. You can use burnt earth and mix it with a little bit of organic material, like with some organic fertilizer as well. Yes. Make sure that you have good drainage though, because you still need the water to drain through the soil. It should not become waterlogged.
Yeah, and Gillian, just adding on, we actually grow some of our Dendrobiums and Vandas. We just grow them on PVC pipes back in our nursery.
That's fantastic. How simple.
Yeah. Okay, next question by Audrey Chan. How do we help Cataleya orchids to bloom? Well, we didn't touch anything on Cataleya today. Well, generally Cataleyas will flower once a year for you, generally in Singapore. There's a whole new can of worms, the Cataleyas section. But generally they need bright light. They need more fertilizers than Vandas and Dendrobiums. They are what we call heavy feeders. And yeah, they store up enough energy and they'll put out flowers once a year.
Our next question is from Josias Ding. What should we do post-bloom? Basically, I think that orchids should just be fed weekly with alternating between Gaviota 63 and 67. It will give your orchids basically whatever they need to stay healthy, to grow in a robust way, and to build up energy for the next round of flowering. Now, if you were a professional grower, you would probably know when to expect the next flower, and then you could increase the amount of phosphorus and potassium that you give the plant. But for a home grower, I would say just keep your orchid well fed and it will flower in its time. Would you agree, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely, Gillian.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question by Anne Korean. After you cut the top half of the orchid, what do you do with the bottom half? Okay, so just now Gillian mentioned about the sympodial and monopodial orchids. For top cutting, that applies to monopodial orchids like we have done. over here. The bottom half, well, sometimes you could actually keep it there and it will produce a side shoot. We don't have any examples today of a side shoot. Or for example, actually this guy, if you top cut, sometimes if you top cut at this point, you have the top section that grows into a new plant. Sometimes below the cut point, if it's still green and it's still healthy, it may produce a side shoot.
Okay, our next question is from David Cheong. Where do you recommend we can get good and cheap orchid plants? Maybe Mark, would you like to take that question?
Okay, I think some of our online material has a list of orchid nurseries that you can buy your orchids from. I believe we have Woon Lane Nursery and Toh Garden, and there are actually quite a few more in the Lim Chu Kang area. So you can just punch in a quick Google and you will get a whole list of orchid nurseries.
Thanks so much, Mark. Our next question is from Eleanor Chan. Are there any low-cost alternatives for fertilizers? Well, I would say perhaps organic fertilizers might be a bit cheaper than inorganic fertilizers, so you could use that. You could also perhaps look into the idea of composting. You know, if you have plant materials from your food that you were otherwise going to throw out, you could try to compost it. If you have a garden, you can just throw it directly on your garden soil. If you have a garden and you have dead plant material from the garden, you can also scatter the dead material on the soil. Here at the Botanic Gardens, we actually use leaf litter to help our plants stay healthy.
Yep. So just adding on, when all these leaf litter, when it gets broken down, so it converts to nitrogen that can be taken up by the plant. Of course, we have to be careful not to block the active growing points of the plant, because that may be a point where the rot might set in. So set your leaf litter or your compost on the outer parts of the plant. That should be okay.
Well, of course, I have to take the next question because it's directed at me. So Susan Chua says, sorry, Dr. Gillian, can I ask, when you say the leaves show a darker green color, does it mean that it's not healthy? Or is it healthy but instead is getting too much sunlight? So I would say that, where was our dark green plant? Usually if you have a dark green plant, and this is a beautifully healthy green plant, there is not a single blemish, I would say. It's a beautiful color, there's no yellowing, there are no black spots. It is a healthy plant, but it is dark green. So when you have a healthy plant that is dark green, it means that it's not getting enough sunlight. So you should try to increase sun exposure and continue to monitor it as well, because then if you go too extreme, you might end up with too much sun and then your plant will start turning yellow. So you have to keep moving your orchid in order to find a good spot in your balcony or your garden. And the moment you get the sunlight right, your plant will start flowering for you, because sunlight is so important for flowering.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so we have another question by Andy Lim. The new orchid buds on my plant also keep going brown. Any idea why? Well, like we mentioned earlier, could be an environmental, a change in the environment that might cause it to blast. Sometimes it's the weather. Sometimes if you have shifted your plant, that is when the blast occurs. And also if your plants get stressed, when it's too dry, they will start to blast as well.
The next question, which is the last question, is from Sweat Lei Liang. And the question is, how to repot orchids when its roots are tightly grasping the pot? As you can see, Mark did kind of, take a while to loosen the orchid just now from the pot. because their roots do indeed cling on to the pot. But you just have to try to jiggle it, try to yank it out. Sometimes brute force works, and it's okay if a few roots are damaged. It's got so many healthy roots anyway. So yeah, just yank it out and repot it as we have demonstrated earlier.
Just to add on, usually what I do is I keep my left hand firmly on the left side of the pot, and I hold the orchid on the right, and I go in different directions. So that helps to loosen the orchid from the pot as well.
Yeah. Mark, would it help to wet the pot? Does it loosen the orchid at all?
Well, I think so. That's worth a try. Usually I just do it when the pot is dry, actually.
Yeah, me too. Thank you everyone for your fantastic questions.
Okay, one last piece of advice. Many people get their orchid growing information from the internet. There's nothing really wrong with it, but you should be aware of where the advice is coming from. Someone living in the US or Europe might recommend full sun for a particular plant, but full sun in a temperate climate is quite different from the full sun in our tropical climate. It is best to seek advice and read books from orchid growers in climates similar to ours in Singapore.
That's all the time we have for this webinar. We have thoroughly enjoyed this session and interacting with you, and hope that you have acquired some useful knowledge. A recording of this video will be posted on the NParks YouTube channel tomorrow. The channel also has many other resources on gardening, so do look on our website for more information on future masterclasses. Before you go, we did promise that you will get to redeem an exclusive seed pack. Do take part in our short feedback form. The first 200 respondents to complete the form will get to redeem an exclusive seed pack. Scan the QR code here. We'd like to leave you with a video of our Gift to the Gardens program. Please refer to our website to find out more. Wishing you happy orchid growing.
The Singapore Botanic Gardens is a people's gardens that's held dearly by the community. Many of us cherish the experiences and memories of our visits with our families, friends, and loved ones. And over its long history, the gardens has flourished with the support of the community. Together, we have created spectacular gardens and spaces for everyone to enjoy. Connecting people and plants. Preserve and enhance our natural and cultural heritage. And contributed immensely to the knowledge of plants of Singapore and the region as the leading tropical botanical institution. We have inculcated a love for nature and environmental stewardship through outreach and educational programs for all ages. And put Singapore on the world map of flower shows. We've achieved all this with the support of our partners and the community. Thank you for supporting the Singapore Botanic Gardens. Together, we have become the only tropical botanic gardens in the world to be designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But our work is not done, and we want to achieve more with your support. Please visit our website today to learn more about the Gift to the Gardens program.